History. History doesn't repeat. But every now and then it throws us something so strange, so absurd that you can't help but wonder if humanity has always been just a little unhinged. Tonight, we're headed back to the Middle Ages, a world of crusaders, relics, visions, and desperation. A time when men believed the bones of saints could win them battles, and when children believed their innocence alone could conquer empires. Now, we're not talking about the great victories or the kings with golden crowns. No, this show is more about the oddities. The moment where hunger, hope, and faith push people into choices that make us laugh, shake our heads, and maybe even recognize a little too much of ourselves in the mirror. These aren't polished stories of knights in shining armor. They're rough, they're messy, and they're human. And they remind us that the line between belief and madness has always been thin. I am JE and this is the Bard's Forge. It's the summer of 1098, and the First Crusade is deep into its year of misery. You're one of tens of thousands of Europeans who answered Pope Urban's call to liberate the Holy Land. You were promised glory, salvation, and let's be honest, probably a little bit of loot. Instead, you got hunger, disease, and the worst case of buyer's remorse since Eve bit into the apple. The Crusaders had marched across Anatolia, fought their way through the hostile lands, and now they seized one of the crown jewels, Antioch, a massive fortified city that controlled the road to Jerusalem. Capturing Antioch should have been the turning point. Instead, it was a nightmare. Because within days of taking the city, the Crusaders became the besieged. A Muslim relief army surrounded Antioch. Imagine that. You fight for months to take a city, and the moment you raise your banner, you're now the one trapped behind the walls. Morale was non existent. Food supplies were gone. There were reports of men gnawing on leather, eating rats, and even whispers of maybe cannibalism. Disease ripped through the camps. Desertions were rampant, and commanders squabbled over leadership. And in the middle of all this misery, the Crusaders did what people always do when reality looks bleak. They turned to faith. Enter Peter Bartholomew. Now, he's not a knight, he's not a noble, not even a commander. He's a poor priest with a talent for visions. The kind of guy today who'd probably run a conspiracy channel on YouTube or maybe even KLRN radio. Peter claimed that St. Andrew himself appeared to him not once but multiple times with a very clear message. The Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross, was buried under the Cathedral of St. Peter right here in Antioch. Now, let's face it, in the Middle Ages, relics were a little bit like Pokemon cards. You got to catch them all. Saints' bones, bits of the true cross, milk from the Virgin Mary, you name it. Relics drew pilgrims, money, and prestige, and in the context of starving, dying army, they could draw something even more valuable: hope. So when Peter Bartholomew announced that the Holy Lance was waiting just a few feet beneath the boots, the Crusade leadership faced a choice: call him a lunatic or hand him a shovel. They chose a shovel. So picture, if you will, the cathedral at Antioch, dozens of half-starved soldiers and priests digging like maniacs by torchlight, hours upon hours of swinging picks, hauling dirt, their bodies reeking of sweat and sickness. The deeper they dug, the more frantic the work became. Chroniclers say the men prayed and wept as they searched, desperate for any sign of divine favor. At one point, they dug so deep the hole threatened to collapse. There was nothing but rubble, dust, and disappointment. Many began to rumble that Peter was a fraud, that this was madness. And then, at the very moment spirits were about to crack, Peter himself jumped into the pit, dug with his bare hands, and came up clutching a rusty iron spearhead. Half the camp erupted into cheers. The other half muttered that it looked suspiciously like the tip of an old Roman spear left in the dirt for centuries. But the Crusaders, they didn't need proof. They needed a miracle, and if a rusty spearhead was all they had, then by God, it was the Holy Lance. The impact was immediate. Men who had been ready to desert suddenly believed they had the divine backing. Soldiers who could barely stand from hunger strapped on their armor. The Holy Lance became a talisman of victory. Within days, the Crusader leadership made the insane decision they would march out and face the Muslim force's vastly superior army in open battle. And on the morning of June 28th, 1098, the Crusaders emerged from Antioch. Eyewitnesses would describe them as skeletal, gaunt, many too weak to hold formation, yet they marched with a zeal that terrified their enemies. And then came the legend. Chroniclers swore as the Crusaders charged, they were joined by an army of saints, ghostly figures of dead heroes and apostles riding on white horses, thundering down from the heaven to scatter the enemy. Was it a mass hallucination brought on by starvation? Wishful thinking by chroniclers who wanted to give God the credit, almost certainly. But to the Crusaders in that moment, it was real. They believed heaven had opened and saints rode beside them. The truth is less divine, but just as dramatic. Kerboga's army was a coalition of rival princes and emirs, many of whom hated each other more than they hated the Crusaders. When the Crusaders attacked with suicidal ferocity, cracks appeared in the coalition. Some of Kerboga's allies deserted, others panicked, and what should have been a rout of the Christians turned into the rout of the Muslims. The Crusaders won. Against all odds, they won. And in their minds, it was the Holy Lance, the relic of Christ's passion, that had secured victory. After the battle, the Holy Lance was paraded as proof of divine favor. Peter, once a nobody, became a prophet. He carried the lance in the future campaigns. His reputation was soaring. But fame in the Middle Age was fickle. Many knights and bishops doubted him, whispering that he had planted the relic in the cathedral. Eventually, the criticism grew so loud that Peter demanded an ordeal by fire to prove his honesty. In April 1099, he walked between two great piles of burning wood. The flames kissed and licked at his body. His flesh charred, and though he stumbled out alive, he died of his burns days later. A fittingly grim end for a man whose visions had once resurrected an army. So what does this little episode tell us? Why does it matter that a starving army dug up a rusty spearhead and convinced himself it was holy? Well, because this is the forge. History doesn't repeat, but the hammer strikes close enough you can feel the closeness of the ring. The Cadaver Army of Antioch is a case study in the power of belief. It didn't matter if the Holy Lance was real. What mattered was the men believed it was real. And that belief carried them in the battle with confidence of divine backing. Fast forward to today. Soldiers still carry tokens in the combat, family photos, lucky coins, religious charms. Armies still rally around symbols, flags, mottos, even mascots. And propaganda is still used to convince men they fight with destiny on their side. During the Gulf War, American psyops were being faked radio broadcasts in the Iraqi camps, claiming that entire divisions had defected. In World War II, the Allies staged whole phantom armies with inflatable tanks to deceive the enemy. The truth is, the technology changes, but the psychology doesn't. Relics in 1098, fake news in 2025. Once again, the hammer doesn't hit in the same place, but it strikes close enough that that echo is unmistakable. So at Antioch, faith gave starving men the strength to march out of their graves and into victory. But what happens when the same faith doesn't inspire the starving, but the innocent? What happens when it sends children to their death? At Antioch, uh, in 11th century, we move forward to 1212, and we move into what is called the Children's Crusade. It was 114 years after Antioch, and the crusading movement was still grinding along. Now, the First Crusade had ended with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, but since then, things hadn't gone so well for the Christians. Jerusalem had been retaken by Saladin in 1187. The Third Crusade had floundered despite Richard the Lionheart's best swashbuckling, and by the early 13th century, the Holy Land was still firmly out of Christian hands. Enter the idea, the Children's Crusade. Now, we're using the word crusade here generously because it wasn't an official crusade that was called for by a pope. There was no papal bull, no royal backing, no armies of knights in shiny mail. This was something much stranger. A grassroots movement that spread like wildfire across France and Germany. In Germany, a boy named Nicholas of Cologne claimed to have visions. He told people that God wanted the innocent, the children of Europe, to march to the Holy Land because their purity would succeed where hardened knights had failed. Meanwhile, over in France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed that Jesus himself had given him a letter to deliver to the King of France. Now, spoiler, the king wasn't impressed, not a bit. But Stephen's charisma was enough to rally thousands of followers. So, on both sides of Europe, children and teenagers, many barely in the adolescence, started gathering into processions. They were joined not only by actual children, but by some poor peasants, vagabonds, and, well, desperate parents who figured, well, maybe everything else has failed. Maybe the kids can really do it. So, picture the scene. Thousands of children trudging across Europe, banners held high, singing hymns. Chroniclers say the movement gathered steam as it went. Villagers cheered them on. Priests would bless them. Parents sent their sons and daughters to join. It really was faith and innocence on parade. But from a logistical standpoint, not so much. There were no supply trains, no food stocks, no knights leading them. These really were just kids, peasants, and idealists walking across hundreds of miles in the summer heat. Hunger would strike quickly. Disease, of course, soon to follow. Many simply collapsed along the roadside. And yet, the march pressed on. In Germany, Nicholas led thousands south toward the Alps, intending to cross into Italy and reach the sea. In France, Stephen led his followers toward excuse me, I almost sneezed there. Marseille, hoping to set sail for the Holy Land. Sadly, this is where the story tips from tragic into the absurd. The core belief of the Children's Crusade was that God could part the seas, not as he had for Moses, but even grander. These kids genuinely expected that when they reached the Mediterranean, the waters would just simply roll back and they'd march across the seabed straight into Jerusalem. So, once again, picture thousands of ragged, exhausted kids standing on the beaches of Marseille, waiting for the sea to split into two. They would pray, they would sing, they would weep, and then they would wait. The sea would not move. Two merchants offered to provide ships for the children. No need to part to sea, they would say. We'll carry you across safely. The children and their leaders agreed. 7 ships were loaded with hundreds, maybe in the thousands, of children. But the cruelest punchline of yet was to be revealed. Those merchants were slavers. Instead of taking the children to the Holy Land, they sold them in North Africa. Some were brought in to Tunis, others shipped onward to Egypt, and possibly destinations even further east. Few were ever heard from again. The rest of the movement would scatter. Some kids, of course, tried to return home. Many perished crossing the Alps or collapsed in Italian cities. Now, a few may have found their way into actual Crusader armies years later. But the Great Children's Crusade ended in tragedy, with most of the participants dead, enslaved, or simply gone from history. The Children's Crusade wasn't really about kids storming Jerusalem. It was about desperation. After a century of crusading failure, people clung to the idea that innocence could succeed where knights and kings had failed. And it was about exploitation. Charismatic visionaries like Nicholas and Stephen whipped up fervor. Local priests and lords encouraged the movement, hoping it might just spark a genuine miracle. And then reality didn't deliver. Opportunists like the slavers, of course, would step in to profit. Now, marching across Europe with no food or money is admittedly less a military strategy and more of what you might find on reality TV Survivor Medieval Edition. But we have to look at what this means for us today. The Children's Crusade is often told as a cautionary tale of misplaced faith. And in the forge of history, the strike does land close to home. Even now, we see youth movements are being mobilized. Sometimes nobly, most of the times in a manipulative fashion. Children and teenagers are still pulled into conflicts not of their making. Whether it's children soldiers in Africa, indoctrinated madrasa students in the Middle East, or even the way modern politics uses teenagers as mascot for adult agendas. The hammer blow of 1212 rings on. The medieval belief was that innocence had power. Today we still romanticize youth as a kind of purity weapon. But history has shown repeatedly that putting children on the front line, literally or metaphorically, will always end in tragedy. So in Antioch, relics and visions turn starving men into an army. In 1212, visions and innocent turn children into corpses and slaves. Two sides of the same coin. Sadly, with faith as salvation and faith as ruin. And that's the echo we still feel daily. Once again, history doesn't repeat, but the forge of history, the hammer, falls close enough to its original strike. It does leave echoes loud enough that if you listen, you can still hear them ring. Two moments separated by 100 years, tied together by the same force. And when we sit back and we look at it, whether it be 400, 600, even 1,000 years into the future, we will all see the footsteps that were laid before us. And yet we still fall into those footsteps or damn near side of them every single time. Humanity is funny that way. And far brighter men and women maybe one day will figure out why. I want to thank everyone for turning into the premiere of the Bard's Forge. I will be taking a couple oddities from history and finding a way to show how they still repeat, how the strike of the Forge is always near the previous strike. It's there if we look, and I'm going to try to shine that light on that. With every episode, I'm going to bring 2 stories, sometimes similar, sometimes not, and show how they are utilized today from a slightly different perspective. And in 2 weeks, on the next episode, bring your appetite because I'm going places you've probably never heard me before. I may get a little political. This is my chance to strike in areas I have been reluctant to strike before. Because next episode we will be talking about sausage and beer. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all again for tuning into the premiere. I will see you in 2 weeks at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. Hopefully, I will catch everyone Sunday night for our ITC 70 where we talk Project Serpo. Until then, stay tuned here on KLRN Radio for Jen and Rick, continuing the news of the day and commenting on life. Until then, peace, my friends.